The universe appears to be fine-tuned for life. If the cosmological constant, the gravitational constant, the neutron to proton mass ratio, or even the irregularities in the distribution of matter and energy in the very early universe were different from their actual value by the tiniest amount, the consequences would be disastrous. Life could not evolve anywhere in the universe. So, why do they all fall into the narrow life-permitting range, particularly when it seems that they could have taken on a huge range of values? One answer is that an intelligent mind designed the universe so as to allow for life. This claim represents the core of what philosophers have naturally called the fine-tuning argument for theism, the FTA for short. But another answer, far more attractive to non-theistic scientists and philosophers, is the multiverse hypothesis. There are a huge number of universes within which these aforementioned constants of physics take on random values. If this collection is large enough, then it is not surprising that somewhere or other a life-permitting universe arose by chance alone. And crucially, we could not possibly have observed any other values for physics than those that allow for life, obviously enough. Given this huge collection and the relevant self-selection effect that we couldn't have observed any other values, we should not be surprised that our universe is fine-tuned for life. Michael Rota has argued, however, that even if we grant that a multiverse exists, one can still not avoid inference to a cosmic designer, because our life-permitting universe gives us reason to think that we exist within a theistic multiverse rather than a naturalistic one. Despite its promise for resolving the multiverse objection to the FTA, I will argue that Rota's argument fails. First, some stage setting is in order. The fine-tuning argument claims that the fact that an ever so slight change to the values of various features of physics would render the universe inhospitable to life is strong evidence for theism over naturalism. The principle of theory evaluation underwriting this chain of reasoning is the commonsensical claim that, quote, an observation E counts in favor of hypothesis H1 over H2 if the observation is more probable under H1 than H2. Naturalism and theism are two hypotheses. For naturalism, the likelihood of a fine-tuned universe is outrageously small, along the lines of 1 part in 10 to the 136th power. Theism, by contrast, makes a fine-tuned universe far more likely. Alvin Plantinga, expressing a common intuition, writes that the basic idea is that God would want there to be life, and indeed intelligent life with which or whom to communicate and share love. But then, if a fine-tuned universe is dramatically more probable given theism than naturalism, then the fact that there is a fine-tuned universe is strong evidence for theism over and against naturalism. That's the argument in a nutshell, anyway. The leading naturalistic or atheistic response to the FTA is the multiverse hypothesis. The dual claim that 1, there are numerous, probably infinite, universes besides our own, and 2, these universes all differ randomly in their fundamental physical features. Given both these propositions, it follows that somewhere in the collection of universes will by chance appear one that is fine-tuned for life. And of course, we could only exist in such a universe, so it is no surprise, given these two conditions, that we do in fact observe a fine-tuned universe. There's no need to posit some deeper explanation for these features of our universe, of our existence. Many philosophers grant that, at the very least, the multiverse hypothesis, if plausible, quote, mitigates the case for theism from fine-tuning by rendering it less quantitative. One might still make the argument that the multiverse itself requires fine-tuning in a more qualitative, rough and ready way. But philosopher Michael Rota makes the interesting case that even the multiverse hypothesis does not undermine the design inference from quantitatively precise fine-tuning. Rota maintains that a theistic multiverse would probably feature many life-permitting universes, while a naturalistic multiverse would house far fewer. The former claim is plausible given that, quote, since life is a good, any intelligent being has a reason to value it, and thus God would have some reason to create more of it. While the latter follows, given just how improbable such universes are via chance processes alone, 1 part in 10 to the 136th power, as we've seen. In an inflationary multiverse, for instance, quote, our universe could well be an island oasis in a gigantic but largely uninhabitable cosmic archipelago. And that's from Brian Greene. But if the two hypotheses have these differing implications about the ratio of life-permitting to life-prohibiting universes, then, quote, even if the existence of a multiverse is assumed, the fine-tuning argument still succeeds. Consider an analogy that I have simplified from Rota's work. There are two boxes in front of you, one with 99 white balls and one black ball, and one with one white ball and 99 black balls. The boxes are shuffled randomly. You then pull out a ball without looking inside. Opening your eyes, you see that the ball in your hand is white. With no other information, is it more likely that the ball came from the first box or the second? Well, the probability of drawing a white ball from the first is 99%, while it is only 1% for the second. The right inference to draw, then, is that the ball was almost certainly selected from the first box. Return to the multiverse. We observe a life-permitting universe. Does this universe feature as part of a grand theistic multiverse or a naturalistic one? Just like pulling a white ball from the box, we ought to infer that we are in a theistic multiverse. The upshot is that even if the multiverse explains fine-tuning in a sense, it does not avoid inference to a cosmic designer. Now, assessing Rota's argument requires answering two questions. First, would a high likelihood of a life-abundant multiverse given theism undercut the multiverse response to the FTA? And two, does a life-abundant multiverse have a high likelihood given theism? The first question concerns the relevance of a particularly life-abundant multiverse, while the second concerns its likelihood. And we will look briefly at each of these questions in turn. With respect to that first question, one aims to determine if it is even relevant to consider theistic multiverses and their internal composition, at least so far as the FTA is concerned. Both a natural and a theistic multiverse make it likely that some universe or other will be fine-tuned for life, even if a naturalistic multiverse does not make it likely that this universe would be fine-tuned. But truly, all we need to explain is the former. Well, it turns out that assessing that particular issue immediately forces one to consider the enormously complicated debate surrounding the inverse gambler's fallacy and the principle of total evidence, whether our universe possesses its features essentially or not, and a slew of variations on the same basic thought experiment involving urns, balls, dice, and fish named Asha. And we don't have the space to assess those issues here. So I will just grant an affirmative answer to our first question. If the relevant likelihood is high, we would have a powerful reply to the multiverse objection. Still, is that likelihood high? Or non-negligible, I should say, at least not terribly unlikely. In unpacking the claim that God would likely create a life-abundant multiverse, it will be helpful to consider three distinct claims one might make in this context. One, the likelihood that God would create a fine-tuned universe is not terribly low. Two, the likelihood that God would create a multiverse is not terribly low. Three, the likelihood that God would create a life-abundant multiverse is not terribly low. The first claim lies at the heart of the FTA. Anthropic fine-tuning is far more likely conditional on theism than on naturalism. The second claim is more provocative. Given theism, it is not vanishingly unlikely that we ought to expect a multiverse. The third claim, though related to the second, is more ambitious. Not only can we say that God is not terribly unlikely to create a multiverse, we can go further and say with confidence that God is not terribly unlikely to create a multiverse filled with life-permitting universes in particular. Now, Rota will contend that claims 2 and 3 amount to the same thing because, quote, the reasons to create many universes that God would have are also reasons to think that a significant proportion of universes created by God would be life-permitting. I am not so sure, and I will draw attention to a few cases where an argument for 2 is not also an argument for 3. But nevertheless, the arguments for 2 and 3 focus in on a particular attribute of God that God by hypothesis possesses, and then argue that if God has that attribute, it is not unlikely that he would create a multiverse. That is, 1, God is X. 2, if God is X, it is not terribly unlikely that he would create a life-abundant multiverse. 3, therefore, it is not terribly unlikely that God would create a life-abundant multiverse. Premise 1 will usually follow from the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, and we will just grant that premise in each of the arguments that follow. Looking at 2, there are basically 2 attributes thought to make this premise plausible, thought to fill in the blank for X. God's creativity and God's love. And there are others, but we only have time to look at those two. In every case, it seems to me that the proffered reasons for accepting this premise display an unwarranted confidence in our ability to predict divine psychology, what God would or would not do in some circumstance. Consider appeals to God's creativity and limitless resources. Paul Draper writes that the existence of a multiverse given theism, quote, is high not because there is any independent evidence for it, but rather simply because a perfectly good God of limitless creative resources would be likely to create vastly many worlds, including magnificent worlds of great perfection, as well as good but essentially flawed worlds that are more in need of special providence. Similarly, Robin Collins contends that because God is considered infinite and infinitely creative, it makes sense that creation would reflect these attributes, and hence that physical reality would be much larger than one universe. But of course, from the mere fact that God could do X, it does not follow that God would do X, or that God would likely do X, or even that God would not be terribly unlikely to do X. God is omnipotent, and the range of his possible actions is infinite. Indeed, it seems to me that compared to true limitlessness, a single universe and a multiverse of any particular infinite extent or cardinality are equally insignificant. For any multiverse or possible created reality God could have fashioned, he could have made an even more expansive one. Against this ever-increasing list of possibilities, why should any particular multiverse or universe rank as more likely than a single universe? One might object that a principle of indifference would lead us to think that a multiverse of some extent or other is more likely than a single universe, given that there are infinite possible multiverses, I suppose, individuated by the number of universes they're in, but only one way of getting a single universe. Like, in other words, the number of numbers greater than one is infinite, but there's only one way to get one, and that's just one, roughly. However, applying a blanket principle of indifference to an infinite set of options leads to incoherence, as several philosophers have pointed out in the context of the normalizability objection to the FTA. So if one wants to press this kind of response, they'll have to do more work than just mentioning the principle of indifference. Turn then to considerations related to God's love. While Turner 2003 is clear that, quote, God is perfect, lacking nothing, and so God plus the universe is no better than God alone, nevertheless, he contends that God is a loving God, and while he does not need anyone to show his love to, nevertheless, his love leads him to create beings to show his love to. Now, the Christian theist, at any rate, will find this reasoning less than compelling because God is tri-personal, and therefore can express his love without a created order. Now, Timothy O'Connor considers this objection, but argues that, quote, it is equally plausible that a natural impetus toward inward expression of divine goodness would be matched by an impetus to outward sharing of goodness with non-divine creatures. This argument strikes me as a remarkably thin reed upon which to base the relevant appeal to divine psychology, as Craig 2010 points out. Indeed, calling the intra-Trinitarian displays of love inward expressions is ambiguous. If the claim concerns the persons of the Trinity considered individually, it is incorrect. The proposal is not that the Son loves himself, but that the Son loves the Father loves the Holy Spirit, and so on. Thus, each person of the Trinity does indeed love outwardly. If the Trinity as a whole is in view, it is no longer clear that outward displays of goodness and love are necessary or likely from a tri-personal being, however necessary they might be for unipersonal beings like us. So, is there a general way in which all of these kinds of arguments go wrong? Well, while it seems right to think that if God existed, we ought to expect far more good in general to suffuse reality than if naturalism were true, because God is perfectly good, it is far less clear that we can claim of any particular good that if theism is true, we ought to ascribe a higher likelihood to that good than a likelihood given naturalism. There are just so many possible goods. Who are we to assess God's likely inclinations when faced with what is probably an infinite range of possible good things and good ends? Poston 2014 puts the point well, explaining that, quote, there are many different incompatible yet valuable states of affairs. Thus, unless we have some reason of dividing up the space of possibilities in a favorable way, it is doubtful that one can simply move from the value of a particular good to the judgment that theism predicts that particular good. It is for that reason, more than any other, that the above two sets of considerations fail to provide adequate reason to affirm premise 2 in the argument for a non-negligible likelihood of a multiverse, given theism. The implication of this final point is quite far-reaching, insofar as many theistic arguments rely on the implicit chain of reasoning, X is good, therefore God is not terribly unlikely to bring X about. They will fall prey to the same central failing as Rota's argument for thinking a multiverse likely if God exists. If unresolvable, this objection threatens to unseat a host of theistic arguments. Those from consciousness, the applicability of mathematics, psychophysical harmony, and so on. So perhaps this objection is not insurmountable, but I have yet to see an adequate response to it. There are at least two objections to my critique of the second step of Rota's argument that I will consider here. One way out would be to argue for some privileged status attaching to conscious life, such that we ought to ascribe it a higher likelihood than any other particular good. This is not an altogether implausible claim. Though writing in a much different context, William Rowe maintains that, quote, every intrinsic good necessarily involves conscious experience, and the highest intrinsic good human beings are capable of involves conscious experience of God. Similarly, Poston himself contends that the likelihood of God's bringing about some state of affairs is proportional to the amount of value it would realize, and that non-divine free creatures are far more valuable than any state of affairs not involving such creatures, other than divine free creatures. In general, it does seem difficult to conceive of something more intrinsically valuable than a person. I grant that. We might then infer that if theism were true, it would not be terribly unlikely that lots of people would exist, so that the realization of the highest intrinsic good, communion with God in a personal way, would be possible. But let me register three worries I have about this argument. First, even if it were true that every intrinsic good involves conscious experience, God himself is consciously aware of everything he creates, such that human perception of the relevant goods is not necessary to secure their status as good. So, for instance, if God created universes devoid of life but featuring the most exquisite beauty, that beauty would still be intrinsically valuable because God would certainly be aware of it. Second, it is far from obvious that intrinsically valuable states of affairs have to involve or entail conscious awareness. Would not a beautiful painting be just as beautiful if no one were around to perceive it? Third, even if we grant that more universes in a theistic multiverse would house life than compared to a natural one, it doesn't follow that more universes in a theistic multiverse would be life permitting. God can bring about life without making the universe life permitting in at least two ways. One, he could create immaterial life, angels and demons perhaps, without thereby having to secure a universe that can safely house physical life. Or secondly, given his omnipotence, he can even create physical life in a hostile universe simply by miraculously sustaining it in existence. And why should we think that these possibilities are any less likely than pursuing life in the conventional way of physicality in a life-permitting universe? It's not clear to me. Objection number 2, what I'm calling probabilistic coherence. One might further object that if we think good states of affairs in general have a higher likelihood on theism than naturalism, then we must, on pain of probabilistic incoherence, affirm that particular goods have a higher likelihood as well. Consider a simplified model, a toy model, if you will, of the possibility space of all possible, mutually exclusive states of affairs that might exist were theism or naturalism true. If we adopt a Bayesian epistemological framework, the likelihood attaching to these states of affairs must sum to 1. Let us say that there are 5 good states of affairs and 5 bad ones. The likelihood of any particular state of affairs obtaining will be 1/10. And the likelihood of good ones, irrespective of the particular one that turns up, will be 1/2. Clearly enough. The probabilities here will function much the same as if we considered a 10-sided die, each side numbered 1 to 10. The likelihood of an even-numbered side obtaining will similarly be 1/2. But then consider theism, a worldview that, as we have granted, attributes a higher likelihood to good states of affairs than bad ones. We need not claim that bad states of affairs have 0 likelihood given theism, just that the likelihoods work out so that theism leads us to expect reality to skew towards good, while naturalism skews towards a more or less random assortment of goods and evils. And that much seems reasonable enough. If it really is the case that we ought to expect more goods on theism than naturalism, then theism must attribute a higher likelihood than 1/2 to goods in general. Theism in this case is like a biased die, say biased towards even-numbered sides. Let's stipulate for the sake of illustration that the likelihood of good states of affairs given theism is 9/10. How then are we to divide up this likelihood among the 5 particular possible goods? Well, if we have no reason to think God would prefer this or that good over any other, then a principle of indifference would lead us to divide 9/10 by 5, given that there are 5 possible goods. Thus, the likelihood of any particular good given theism is 9/50, or 0.18, 18%. But the likelihood of a particular good given naturalism was 0.1. Thus, the likelihood of any particular good given theism is higher than given naturalism. Whether we label that likelihood terribly unlikely or not, all that matters for Rota's argument is that the likelihood is higher given theism than given naturalism. Thus, if we grant that a life-abundant multiverse is good, then the likelihood of such a multiverse given theism will be higher than given naturalism. Despite the straightforward logic of this line of reasoning, it has a central failing shared by the first objection. If theism is true, then there are more possible goods than if naturalism is true. Roughly put, naturalism can only yield goods consistent with naturalism, obviously enough. But if theism is true, then non-natural or non-physical goods are realizable as well, in addition to all the natural ones. God can create immaterial realities, supernaturally infused physical realities, literally miraculous universes, and so on, along with all the attendant goods that are thereby realized. Think again of the dice analogy. It is not merely that theism biases the die towards even-numbered sides, but also that theism gives us a die with more even-numbered sides than does naturalism. So the simple probability argument above will not work. I obviously have no idea how many such goods this new possibility space opens up, but the crucial point is that it is up to Rota to establish that it is few enough that one can still make that can claim that the likelihoods all work out such that the likelihood of a particular good is greater than the likelihood given naturalism. I do not know of any way of arguing for that claim, and so I think that Rota's argument does not succeed. In short, while it is not clear to me that a high likelihood of a life-abundant multiverse given theism is relevant to the multiverse objection in the first place, it does seem clear that there's very little good reason to think that a life-abundant multiverse does have a non-negligible likelihood given theism. And that much, anyway, is enough to undercut Rota's argument for a theistic multiverse. The multiverse objection remains a problem for advocates of the fine-tuning argument. Thank you.